So let me orient us to the next session, which we are going to run a tiny bit differently for reasons that I think you'll understand. This is a session that hopes to explore analogous policy examples to help inform the way to think about the policy implications of MRT based upon its characteristics. We have identified, as you'll see in the agenda, 4 different examples. Rather than have the speakers all present sequentially and then discussion, we're actually going to break after each of the topical sets of presentations and then have discussion with the committee because there are different issues likely to be raised from each of the examples. So a little different than we did this morning. We still are asking our speakers to limit their remarks to 10 minutes. We are going to, after the first set, we're going to video mute Nick Hopwood, who's in Cambridge, and ask the other speakers to come to the front so we can engage in a discussion with everybody. So with that said, let me introduce our first speaker in this part of session number 3. The example policy analog that we are talking about in this session is in vitro fertilization, and our first speaker will be Nick Hopwood. Nick is a reader in History of Science and Medicine in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. He is, I think, world expert in the history of IVF in particular as it relates to the birth of the first IVF child. So with that, let me say thanks again to Nick and turn it over to you, and we hope the technology will cooperate.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for making time for history. We have only a little serious historical work on in vitro fertilization, but I hope that this will inform your deliberations. If I talk like that, can you hear me okay?
Quite good, thank you.
Could I have the next slide, please, Michael? So I'm going to say a little bit about 3 roughly chronological phases in the history of IVF. Inventing human IVF in the 1970s, how the technology was made routine in the 1980s, and then a little about IVF as a platform for innovation into the more recent period. I've been asked to consider how ethical and social concerns were aired and to some extent resolved. I'll also highlight issues that resonate with present dilemmas over mitochondrial replacement, but I'll leave you to draw out the implications. You're well aware of the dilemmas, and my expertise is historical. I'll focus on the UK, which I know best, and where IVF began. Could I have the next slide, please? So attempts to achieve human IVF go back to the United States in the 1940s, but the first birth was of Louise Brown in England in 1978. This was the culmination of a collaboration between the physiologist Robert Edwards and the gynecologist Patrick Steptoe, who had controversially claimed in vitro fertilization of human eggs in 1969. In 1971, the UK Medical Research Council rejected a major grant application from Edwards and Steptoe for work on human conception, and they did so on ethical grounds. The reasons are interesting. First, the referees worried about the risk to the patients of hormone treatment and laparoscopy. Edwards and Steptoe had presented what they were doing as experimental therapy, but the referees saw the women volunteers as experimental subjects who did not stand to benefit themselves. At that time, the dominant agenda in the field was population control, was contraception, and alleviating infertility had a low priority. The referees were also concerned about the risk of abnormality in any child. They wanted studies in non-human primates first, which were then seen as much more straightforward than they would be today. Edwards countered that far more was already known about humans, in whom the work was actually easier, and that there was no substitute for human research. Finally, the referees were alienated by the enormous publicity that Edwards and Steptoe had received in newspapers and on television. which was then frowned upon, especially for physicians. But for Edwards and Steptoe, the public debate was necessary to building support and to rebutting objections that many reproductive scientists shared, especially in the United States. So the press was crucial in debating the issues and in shifting the image from that of irresponsible scientists playing God to that of caring physicians helping people have much-wanted children. After the social reforms of the 1960s, fewer babies were available for adoption. There was a greater expectation that women would control their own fertility. So a potentially transgressive science initially gained mainstream backing by supporting the traditional nuclear family. IVF has also been sustained by continuing wide public acceptance of the desire for a genetic connection to a child. In spite of the rejection by the MRC, Edwards and Steptoe were able to carry on using private money from the United States, where a moratorium would block similar work. In December 1971, they began implanting embryos in volunteers. It was a very different ethical landscape then, but there's some evidence of oversight by the NHS Hospital Research Committee, and there was some interaction with professional bodies. When news of a pregnancy leaked out, finally in 1978, it was a huge story. Experts didn't know what to expect. By this time, there was more confidence from embryo transfers in other mammals. There was evidence that major abnormalities would abort spontaneously, but specialists were worried that even the slightest imperfection might be the end of IVF. Then, the front pages hailed baby Louise as a miracle of normality and invited the world to share her parents' joy. Could I have the next slide, please? The birth changed everything, but it was just one success after hundreds of failures. Even Steptoe and Edwards were not sure exactly why it had worked. For the next few years, attention focused on replication. Edwards' closest collaborators in the United States achieved a birth in December 1981. By 1984, there was a total of about 100 clinics in a dozen countries. It was no longer a question of whether IVF, but of how. There was much controversy, as you'll know. Unlike in the United States, in the UK, all parties converged on regulation as the answer to their very different questions. IVF in the UK has been highly regulated at a national level in a system that is also relatively permissive for research. This came out of a committee of inquiry that proposed a framework in 1984. Opposition, especially from Christian groups already organized against abortion, and general hostility in Parliament, led to bills to ban human embryo research and to require direct permission from government for every case of IVF. This also led medical scientists to lobby Parliament and public opinion, including by showing that an interim scheme of medical self-regulation with lay input could work. The outcome was the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act 1990, which set up statutory licensing under a Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. The 1990 Act and its 2008 successor have regulated the in vitro creation of embryos and the storage and use of embryos and gametes. They prohibited certain activities and required a license for others. Let me highlight a couple of issues. IVF has helped change kinship. Distinguishing genetic and gestational motherhood was unprecedented, and IVF has contributed in the end to the diversity of family forms. But under the Act, the only mother was the woman who gave birth. The father was her husband or the man with whom she sought treatment. In 1990, clinics were obliged to take account of what was called a child's need for a father. In 2008, that clause was removed. This relates to the more general issue of access. Most importantly, who can afford IVF or who might see this as appropriate for them. It's very easy to lose sight of this in the flurry of new technologies. Most early clinics, even in the UK, were private, and the state was slow to offer IVF. But treating infertility has gained legitimacy, and NHS guidelines now recommend 3 publicly funded cycles. If I could have the next slide, please. So by no means all involuntarily childless people could access assisted conception, but it was routine enough by the mid-1980s that Time magazine, perhaps prematurely, called it old-fashioned IVF. This classic IVF became a platform for other methods. The existing infrastructure enabled these. I'm not sure it's helpful to see it as a slippery slope, but it is important to consider the full range of possible uses and how these will be controlled. Each innovation has been much debated in the UK, and our highly regulated system has set legal limits. One example is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD. This was long discussed as an alternative to prenatal diagnosis and selective termination, with concern about so-called designer babies and savior siblings, but also public support for PGD. So much so that the wish to promote embryo research helped motivate scientists to pursue it, with the first birth in 1990. PGD is instructive also because the technology has multiple uses. In the UK, it has remained largely a rare means of avoiding certain diseases. Screening for aneuploidies is controversial. Sex selection for social reasons is illegal. Germline genetic modification has been illegal too. As you know, the UK Parliament debated mitochondrial replacement in 2008 with the decision that this could be permitted via a change in regulations rather than primary legislation. Parliament passed that change last month. The HFEA is developing a framework for licensing if the techniques are judged safe and effective on a case-by-case basis. I'm going to end there. My last slide is just a select bibliography of some recent historical publications. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nick, very much. That's perfect and right on time. Stay with us if you would.